Hi, I'm Jean Farish. Welcome to my FlossTube channel. I am glad that you're here with me today. We're going to start with a rather knotty subject, and that is how to do French knots, colonial knots, Palestrina knots, and how to substitute a bead for a knot. This is a question that comes up very often among new stitchers, and there really are quite a variety of solutions to this knotty problem. Okay, no more puns. Okay, so one of the things that makes French knots a challenge on linen is that the weave of the fabric is, when I say coarse, it's coarse compared, say, to the fabric that you would use if you were doing surface embroidery. Now, French knots are very common among people who do surface embroidery. They're great for a flower center. They're great for flowers on a stalk, whatever. And I'm going to show you today how you can alter the weight of a French knot and still be making a French knot. But when it's done on cross-stitch fabric, there just aren't a lot of options of where to place your needle. If you're working on a fine fabric, then when you bring your needle up from the back to the front, and you make your stitch, the idea is that when you put your needle back into the fabric, you're not going into the exact same hole. You're going into a space right next to the hole. Well, on cross-stitch fabric, and if you're working on linen or an even weave, you have an option of going over one thread or one intersection to be next to, but not in the hole. And when you're working on Aida, you have a little bit more options because Aida, remember, is really 4 fabric threads intersecting with 4 fabric threads. So you've got a little bit more of an option with Aida, but not anywhere near the amount of options you would have if you're working on a tightly woven cotton or silk, which is very commonly used for surface embroidery. So let's start with taking a look at the French knot. I'm going to start by demonstrating with a single strand of number 8 pearl cotton. And you're going to bring your needle from the back to the front wherever the chart is telling you to place your French knot. Holding the thread in your non-dominant hand, you're going to wrap the thread around the needle twice, just twice. Whoops. Keep some tension on the thread. And then exit right next to where you entered. Keep the tension on the thread that's around your needle and pull it through. Don't let up on the tension until it's completely through. And there's your French knot. Let me do it again. So you're coming up from the back to the front. You're going to wrap the thread around your needle twice. Now, I like to cross an intersection rather than next to my thread whenever that's possible. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to keep tension on the thread that's wrapped around the needle. Pull it through. So you can see that one is a little bit smaller than the first one. Actually, the consistency is pretty good for those two. So that's a French knot with a number 8 pearl cotton. If you want a larger or bolder French knot, you do not increase the number of wraps around your needle. You always do 2. Instead, you change the weight of your thread. So this is a number 5 pearl cotton. So again, I'm working with a single strand, and I'm just going to wrap it twice. Put my needle next to, not in the same hole. Keep tension on my working thread. And keep that tension on my thread. Whoops. a little too much tension. Keep the tension on my thread until I've pulled it completely through. So you get a larger French knot when you use a thicker thread. Let me see if I can do the next one a little bit more gracefully. By the way, one of the things that makes it a challenge when you're using a tapestry needle is that you can see that the eye of the needle is wider than the shank of the needle. So an alternative, if you're going to do a lot of French knots, it would be worth it to get a milliner's needle rather than a tapestry needle. So again, I'm going to wrap this twice. This time I'm going to go in diagonally across an intersection instead of the thread right next to it. And pull it through and let go when you get to the end. And that's it. So one more thing, I promised that I would also do this with the traditional 2 strands of floss. So let me do that next. Now let's see how it looks if you're working with 2 strands of embroidery floss. The method is the same. I'm going to wrap my thread around my needle twice. This time I'm going to go into a thread next to where I started my stitch, keeping tension on my working thread, and gently pull it through. Wrap it twice. This time I'm going to cross on the diagonal. Holding on to my working thread until I've pulled my needle through. So now you can see 3 distinctly different size French knots, all done the exact same way. 2 strands of floss, a single strand of number 8 pearl cotton, a single strand of number 5 pearl cotton. So that's it for the French knot. I would say the things to be careful about. One is that when you exit with your needle, that you're not going in the same hole. You're going next to or catty corner. You're crossing an intersection with your exit. Also hold on to the thread tension until you've pulled your needle through. If you find it difficult to pull it through, then perhaps you're holding on a little too tightly. If your French knots start looking kind of sloppy, then I would say that you need to increase your tension a little bit. If you want consistent size French knots, the thing is to practice, practice, practice. When you're doing your French knot, if you feel like it's too big, then reduce your number of threads. You still want to wrap it twice. If your French knot is too skimpy and you want a plumper French knot, then increase your number of strands. Now I stitched with 2 strands of floss. You could also use 3 strands or 4 strands. If you have pearl cotton handy in the color that you need, then using a number 12, which is the finest pearl cotton, would be an option. As you saw today, I used a number 8 and a number 5. So that's really all I can tell you about French knots. A long time ago, I learned to do a colonial knot, and that's what I've been doing ever since then. I find them easier to do and easy to get a consistent knot. So let me show you the colonial knot next. When I was doing those French knots, I actually had to stop and think about how to do it because I'm so used to doing a colonial knot. The big difference with a colonial knot is the way you wrap your needle. You're basically going to make a figure 8. So I'm still going to place my thread wherever the chart is calling for the French knot. I'm going to go under the thread. Here, let me move up here so you can see this a little bit better. Okay, so first I'm taking my needle under the thread. Then I'm going to place my thread over the tip of the needle. And then I'm going to exit, not in the same hole, same idea as a French knot. You're going next to or crossing an intersection. Same idea, you still need to hold on to your tension and pull your needle through. Okay, let me show you again. So you're going under with the tip of your needle, over the tip of the needle until it looks like a figure 8. Then you're going to cross an intersection. And you see how this looks on my needle? Hold on to the tension and exit. So that's a colonial knot. One more time. I like to tell myself under, over, around, and through. So under, over, around, and through. I'm going to loosen that up a little bit. I was trying to show you a moment ago when it didn't really, you really couldn't see it. But you see how you're basically, unlike a French knot, my working thread is actually between my loops. And I think that's one of the things that makes it easier. So still have to hold on to the tension of the thread and pull my needle through. And that one got kind of sloppy because I was trying to show you too much. And I also think I may have gone over, no, I still was only going over one thread. So one more time without stopping. Under, over, around, and through. Pull the thread down to the fabric. Hold on to it. Keep your tension on there. Pull your needle through and don't let go until the very last second. So that's a colonial knot. And I just find them a lot easier to do. I find it easier to get a consistent size. Like the French knot, if I wanted a heftier colonial knot, then I would either add another strand of floss or I would go to one of the pearl cottons. So that's, to me, is a good alternative to a French knot. So if you find a pattern with French knots and you love everything about it, except you're saying to yourself, I am not doing French knots, just take a breath and tell yourself that every place it calls for a French knot, you can substitute a colonial knot very easily. Use the same number of strands that are called for, use the same color. The only difference is instead of wrapping it twice, you're going under, over, around, and through. And that's a colonial knot. Next, I want to show you the Palestrina knot. This is more of a stitch than a knot, but I kind of put it in the same category. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. But I just wanted to show you that I used it here in Lady Catherine's garden where I wanted to make it look like stepping stones around the center area of the garden. I say it's more of a stitch than a knot because it can easily replace a single cross stitch. I first used it in places like, let's say if you were doing a design that had a doll or a small creature where the eyes were a single cross stitch. And have you ever noticed that sometimes it can feel like they've gotten kind of lost in the design? Or it's also good, say, if the center of a flower is a single stitch. So wherever you have a single stitch, it sort of seems like it's receding into the background too much, and you'd like for it to be a little bit more dominant, then the Palestrina knot is a good substitute for a cross stitch. So far, the colonial knot and the French knot that we just did, those are usually indicated on a chart kind of in a hole. They're not in the center. They can be in the center of a square, but they're not taking up a whole square. So the Palestrina knot, if you're working with linen or even weave, it would be done 2 threads wide and 2 threads high. It can also be done on Aida, and you'll be covering 1 square. So let me show you how to do that. So imagine on my chart, I have an indication that I have a cross stitch. That's right here. Now I'm going to do a half cross that's backwards, kind of a backward slant to what we usually think of as starting a cross stitch. So again, you can see that I'm just 2 linen threads wide and 2 linen threads high. If I'm working on Aida, that's 1 square. Then I'm going to start my cross by coming in the bottom corner, except instead of going right into this corner, instead I'm going to slip my needle under the half cross. I'm not piercing the fabric. I'm just going under the half cross, and I'm keeping it towards the top of that half cross. Then I'm going to do it again, slipping my needle under the half cross, not piercing the fabric and not piercing the thread. And now I'm on the lower half of that half cross. And notice that I'm being careful to make sure that my needle is over my working thread. So now I'm going to pull that through. And now I'm going to exit in that 4th traditional hole. And watch what happens as I pull this through. The knot kind of rotates, and then you end up with this little knot right here on the top center. So you end up with a knot or a stitch that actually has some heft to it. Let me do that again. So wherever you're supposed to be placing your cross stitch, you're going to enter in what would be the bottom right-hand corner of the square. I'm going to go over 2 threads and up 2 threads. I'm now going to continue by coming in what would be the bottom left-hand corner of that stitch. Sorry, I'm watching my camera instead of my stitching, and I'm jumping all over the place. Okay, so now I've done my half cross, and I'm in the bottom left-hand corner, slipping my needle under the half cross, not piercing the fabric, keeping that on the upper half of that half cross, and then down below it, slipping my needle again under the half cross, not catching the thread or the fabric. I'm over my working thread, gonna pull it through, exit in what would be the traditional upper right-hand corner of that square, and pull it on through. So again, you end up with just a heftier texture. And like I say, if you are doing, say, berries on a wreath, a teddy bear's eyes where there's a single stitch, blossoms on a tree, wherever you have a single cross stitch that you want to have just a little bit more texture, a Palestrina knot is a good substitute. So try that one. And finally, I want to talk to you about substituting beads for French knots. The thing that you need to be careful about is the size of the bead that you use. And what I have here today are 2 sizes of Mill Hill beads. I have the glass seed beads and a number 8 glass bead. And you can see they're the same color, they're just 2 different sizes. And I have this nice little pad. I really don't know what it's called. I found it in a wonderful little bead shop in London. And I like it because I can place some beads on it, and they tend to stay where I put them. The last thing you want to do is to spill a packet of beads of any size. So these are all the seed beads. And then this is the number 8. So once it's out of the package, you can really see the difference in the size between the two. So the seed bead would be the one you would most normally find that people would be using to substitute for a French knot. Now I switched my color fabric here because I could only find my light colored beads for some reason today, and I wanted there to be some contrast. So I've already placed my threaded needle where I want to place my substitute bead. And I'm going to pick up first a seed bead. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cross an intersection. Let me see if I can come in closer here. I deliberately chose a floss color that matches my fabric, which may seem like it's harder for you to see, but you'll understand why in a moment. So if I'm substituting for a French knot, I only want to cross a single thread intersection. Now, that can get kind of wobbly. So what I suggest that you do is, again, in that same intersection, is to basically you're going to be making like a tiny little cross stitch, except that what you're going to do when you come into the last part of the stitch is you're going to split the 2 strands of floss so that one is on either side of the bead. And there's just something about that locks it into place and keeps it from rolling over. So again, let me show you again. So wherever it is that you're supposed to place your French knot, you bring your needle in. And I should probably explain, I'm using the same color thread as my fabric, because if I'm doing this, I want the bead to be the thing that the eye sees, not the stitch. So regardless of what color bead you're using, try to use a thread that matches the fabric. And you need to use 2 strands. So I've placed my needle where the French knot's going to go. I'm picking up a single seed bead. Sorry, I was off camera. Picking up a single seed bead with my needle. And I'm going to now cross an intersection as if I'm stitching over 1, not over 2. I'm going to push that out of the way so you can see that I'm now coming into what would normally be the 3rd corner. And I'm going to cross that as if I'm completing a cross stitch over 1. And before I bring the thread down, I'm going to split it so that 1 strand is on each side of the bead and pull that down. So that's how I would apply a bead in place of a French knot. So that gives you lots of options when you see French knot and you tell yourself, you know, I want to try it. How do I do it? I've given you that demonstration. If you try it and you find that you cannot do it well, try the Colonial Knot. Palestrina Knot is a good substitute if you actually have an area that's a square on the chart rather than a dot on the chart. And then, of course, a bead is also a good substitute. So you've got options, and you can pick the one that works best for you. I want to bring you up to date on my 2 big works in progress. One is the Roxie Mystery Sampler Stitch Along, and I have just started working on part 3, the 3rd installment for this. the first and second installments are out in everybody's hands, and the next one will be sent out on May 1st. Now, because this is a mystery stitch along, it's kind of a subscription basis, and so I will be sending that, of course, out to the people who have subscribed, who basically just, bought it at my Etsy shop. I mean, that's really all that has to be done. It's not any more elaborate than that. Very simple. So on May 1st, that group of people will get the third part, and then fourth, fifth, and sixth parts will follow, one each month. The big news is that I've decided to cut off subscriptions as of May 15th. The other thing to announce is that I'm going to have a couple of Zoom gatherings for this stitch along. And because it's a subscription basis, that's very easy for me. I simply will send out an email to everyone who has already signed up for the Roxie Mystery Sampler Stitch Along, and telling them the days and times and giving them the invitation. So that's Roxie. Again, right now you can still sign up for it even though we've gotten started. It's very, very easy to catch up because each chart not only has the chart and stitch instructions, diagrams for that part, but it also comes with a very detailed video tutorial. So you can stitch at your own pace. You can watch it as many times as you want to. Very, very easy. My other current work in progress, of course, this doesn't look much like a work in progress. This looks more like one that's finally finished. That's because this is the one my daughter Elizabeth stitched. I'm stitching it on a different color fabric and slightly different color floss choices. And I am working on the final half or so, maybe third of the bottom. Now I got way ahead of everybody else. This is a stitch along that officially started on April 9th. I had been stitching it for a couple of weeks before I actually decided to do a stitch along, which is why I got so far ahead. And as much as I love you all, I wasn't willing to start over completely. So I just stopped stitching at that point and just held on until it was time for everybody else to get started. Now, this is the one that I did a couple of Facebook Live gatherings last week on April 9th. Wasn't real happy with how I handled that. I still might try one more time, but I think that I am going to go to a Zoom gathering going forward for this one, simply because it's easier to interact with everyone. Now, where this gets just a little bit more complicated for me is because it's not a subscription basis, I really don't know who is stitching it unless people have posted about it and tagged me. So in the description for this episode, I'm going to try something completely new, and that is to give you a day and time that we'll do another Zoom gathering with a link. Now, I'm gonna ask that if you are stitching this, or if you think you might want to stitch it, please join us. There will be a limit to how many people we can effectively host, and I'm just going to try this one time and see how this works. If it, I'm going to trust that it's going to work well. If it doesn't, I'll drop back and figure out another way of doing it. But that is the disadvantage of having some sort of stitch along where there isn't a subscription basis. Because again, I don't have email addresses. I don't even have names of the people that are participating. And frankly, most of the charts, the vast majority of the charts were sold through shops. And I doubt if the shops even have an idea of all their customers who bought it. So, so that's my effort to build a community around the Jane Hattersley sampler. And, man, I'm learning a lot about social media and do's and don'ts and whatnot. And going forward, there's a couple things I will do differently. Not going to give up on the idea because I think stitch-alongs are a wonderful way for people who are feel isolated in their stitching, that don't have a group of friends that they get together once a week or once a month to stitch with, that those people can build a community. So I want to be a part of that in some way, and make that happen for as many people as we possibly can. Just need to work out the logistics, but we'll get there. I'm sure that we will. My other work in progress is one that I can't show you because it's not a stitching work in progress yet. It is a design that I'm working on, and it will be to commemorate my Great Parks trip. Now, this is scheduled for September of this year, 2021. We're going to start in Arizona, and we're going to meet actually 2 days before we start visiting the national parks. One of those days we'll spend visiting the attic, a wonderful needle workshop, before we actually get on the coach and start doing the tourist part of it. Now, the day that we're visiting the cross-stitch shop, if your travel buddy is not a stitcher, there'll be other things for them to do if they're not interested in tagging along to the shop. Of course, they're welcome to do that, but you know, they might prefer doing something else. And by the way, we have quite a few couples coming. I think that at this point there's at least 5 or 6 husbands that are coming along with their wives. So if your husband is thinking about coming, but he, you know, thinks that he's going to be the only guy, that's not going to happen. There'll be others that he can pal around with. So that's the Great Parks trip. That's going to be in September. This one is being organized by RGE Travels, and I'm really excited about working with these 2 guys. Ray and John will be on the trip with us, so I know that things will go very, very smoothly. And besides visiting the attic, the other stitching highlight is that I will be teaching a class during the trip. And then, of course, I've also got this commemorative sampler. What I can tell you about it is that it's going to feature a quote from Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president that most people credit for our whole national park system. And it's got some Navajo motifs in it. There's a bison, there's an elk, an eagle, and some other. It's one of my traditional samplers, but with a southwestern flair. So I think it's going to be a fun stitch for the people that are coming on the trip. My other work in progress, actually I guess I should call it a design in progress, except that would be a DIP. I don't know if I really like that acronym. Okay, so the other thing that's on my drawing board is the sampler for the Asia cruise. And this is the one that will start in Hong Kong, and we're going to be visiting ports in Vietnam and in Thailand, and we end up in Singapore. So I am so excited about this trip, not only to be seeing parts of the world that I have never even dreamed that I would get a chance to see, but the colors are just so rich and luscious. I'm just really, really excited about that one. Now, that's also being organized by Ray and John at RGE Travels. So if you're interested in joining that one, there's still plenty of room. In fact, there's still some room. Last I checked, less than a dozen spaces, more like maybe 9 or 10 spots left on the Great Parks trip, but a lot more than that on the cruise. So contact Ray at RGE Travels if you're interested in either or both of those trips. Would love to travel with you. So think about it. As usual, I have more things on my topics I want to talk about list than I seem to have time to cover. But one thing I wanted to talk about today is the question about needle size. And this question has been asked a lot. So the important thing when you're doing counted thread work, whether you're working on linen or even weave on Aida, is you want to use a tapestry needle. This is a mistake that a lot of novices make, and it's a totally understandable mistake in that you go to a store, you know that you're doing counted cross stitch, you know that it's a form of embroidery, and you pick up an embroidery needle. Embroidery needle has a very sharp point because surface embroidery is a different technique than counted thread. With counted thread, the theory is that you're always just taking your needle through air. You're going through a hole in the fabric that's between linen threads or even weave threads or Aida threads, and you're not necessarily trying to pierce the other stitches around it. In fact, ideally, you're missing them completely. And when I say ideally, it's kind of a best practices thing. And if you ever have to rip something out, and who doesn't, then it is certainly easier to take out stitches when they're not embedded in other stitches. So a tapestry needle is what you really want to look for. And a tapestry needle has a point, but it's much rounder. Can you still prick yourself with it? Yes. And so when you read on community bulletin boards or whatnot, or people say, well, the reason a tapestry needle isn't pointed is so that you don't prick yourself and bleed on your work. That is just not true. You can indeed draw blood with a tapestry needle. So forget that. The idea of a tapestry needle having a duller point is because you don't need to pierce anything. You're simply gliding between fabric threads and your stitching threads. So that's one thing. You're looking for a tapestry needle. Second thing is to be careful of the brand. And I make a real effort not to badmouth any brand. So I will just say this in a very guarded way. There's a very famous worldwide brand that is great for threads, that also uses their brand for needles, and I want to tell you they're the worst needles on the market. I just avoid them altogether. The brands that I really like, I like John James needles. Bowen needles are certainly good. Pat Carson has a wonderful line of needles that she has made under her specifications. Tulip makes a good tapestry style needle. So there are good choices out there. Just be aware that your tapestry needle is not a place to cut corners. It is not a place to save pennies. It is the tool that is the universal tool for what we're doing. So do buy the good thing, the good stuff. Now the question usually comes up about what size needle to use. And there you can go online and find kind of charts or scales or whatever you call it, where people will say, on this size fabric, use this. On this size fabric, use this. In general, a number 26 is a good basic needle. A number 24, a number 28, kind of in that range. Now, tapestry needles, I do know that there's one that they may make one that's larger than an 18, but an 18, a 20, 22, those are usually more commonly used for needlepoint because the canvas is coarser than the fabric that we use for counted cross stitch. 28 has become my favorite for stitching on 28 and 30 count linen. So I'll just put that out there and say that's a size that I like best. Now, there are two questions to ask yourself about needle size. The first one is, can I easily thread the eye of the needle with the thread that I am planning to use for this project? So whether you're using a single strand or 2 strands or 3 strands or 4 strands, that's the first thing. Can I fit that number of strands of floss or silk or whatever I'm using through the eye of the needle? That has to be a yes. If the answer is no, that's the wrong size. The second thing is, does the needle glide easily between the linen threads without disrupting them? And if the answer to that question is yes, then you've got the right size. So you want a needle that the eye is large enough that you can thread it easily, but small enough that it will glide through the threads of your linen. Now, recently there has become a whole school of thought that goes along like this. You want a needle that's larger because you want, as you're stitching, you want it to push your linen threads apart so that as you pull your thread through, it doesn't cause abrasion. And I just think that's, oh, what's a ladylike term I can use? That's just nonsense. It makes absolutely no sense to me, which is why I say it is nonsense. Now, for those who believe that and ascribe to that theory, then my blessing to them, and they are certainly entitled to do whatever they want to do. But I am bothered by the fact that that gets taught to new stitchers, and a new stitcher is like a sponge, and they're soaking up all this information, and some of it is true and accurate, and some of it is not. And there are probably people watching this will say, well, Jean doesn't know what she's talking about either. And so to all schools of thought, I say, dabble, try these different things and see what works for you. It is true that linen can abrade your threads, but if you're stitching with a length of thread that's, say, 16 to 18 inches long, you're not going to see enough abrasion in that length to make a difference. So to me, that's not a reason to try to spread those linen threads apart. Because the thing that I wonder about is when you're pushing these threads apart, then you're pushing that thread over towards another thread. And then when you stitch that one, you're pushing those apart, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. I have tried to figure out how it makes sense, and it just doesn't. So I just won't say anything more about it. Anyway, so you know me. I'm going to tell you what I think. I'm going to tell you what works for me. And the bottom line of all of this is try as many different things as you can, and what works for you is what's right for you. So, as always, I hope that you stitch happy and stay safe, and I'll see you right back here next week.